Pleasant evening to everyone. Shall we open our Bibles in the book of Acts, chapter 28, verses 1 to 10. Acts chapter 28, verses 1 to 10. I will read from the New American Standard Bible. You may follow me silently. Acts chapter 28, verses 1 to 10. The word of the Lord says, "When they had been brought safely through, then we found out that there is a land, and this land was called Malta. And the natives showed us extraordinary kindness, for because of the rain that had set in and because of the cold, and they kindled a fire and received us all. But when Paul had gathered a bundle of sticks and laid them on the fire, a viper came out because of the heat and fastened itself on his hand. When the natives saw the creature hanging from his hand, they began saying to one another, 'Undoubtedly this man is a murderer, and though he has been saved from the sea, justice has not allowed him to live.' However, he shook the creature off into the fire and suffered no harm. But they were expecting that he was about to swell up or suddenly fall down dead. But after they had waited a long time and had seen nothing unusual happen to him, they changed their minds and began to say that he was a god. Now in that neighborhood of the place were lands belonging to the leading man of the island named Publius, who welcomed us and entertained us courteously 3 days. And it happened that the father of Publius was lying in bed afflicted with a recurrent fever and dysentery. And Paul went in to see him, and after he had prayed, he laid his hand on him and healed him. And after this had happened, the rest of the people on the island who had diseases were coming to him and getting cured. They also honored us with many marks of respect, and when we were setting sail, they supplied us with all we needed." May the good Lord bless the reading of His words. Going back to chapter 27, you and I will find out that Paul and the other prisoners and even the soldiers who were guarding them left that port called Fair Havens. And then while they were still there, actually they had an argument, and Paul was telling them, "We better stay in this port and spend the winter here, because if we will get out of this place, then probably we will have a very unpleasant experience in the ocean." But the captain of the ship, along with the guard of these prisoners, they made a decision already that they had to sail. And so they left the port and they went on going to their journey headed to Italy, particularly to Rome. Because during this time, Paul thought and made an appeal actually earlier that he is going to present his case and defend himself in front of Caesar. And so he was allowed. That is why they were going to Rome, Italy. While on their way, what Paul was afraid of earlier really happened. A storm came and it challenged their boat. And later in chapter 28, at the end of chapter 27, you will find out there that the boat really had a problem. There was a shipwreck, and praise God, there was a nearby island, and Paul, along with the other prisoners, managed to swim to the island. And surprisingly, if you look at the very name of the island and its meaning, the island was called Malta, and it literally means a refuge. And so if you think about the situation of Paul, that they had a shipwreck, and they were able to manage or to swim near that island, and that island indeed became a refuge for them, and that itself would speak to us the very meaning of the word Malta. And so they were there. They were thankful to the Lord that they were safe. And another thing that they had to thank God for was that the people were described as extraordinary to them, giving kindness to them. Ordinary kindness that was displayed by these occupants of the island. And while they were there, they set a fire so that these people who just came from the sea would be warmed, and then they would be relieved from their condition. And what happened next was this. While they were there, the fire was already there. Paul doesn't like just to sit down and then observe and enjoy the care that they were given by these islanders. And so he stood up also and tried to pick a bunch or a bundle of woods or sticks and tried to place it on a fire. But the problem is this: there was a viper in the bundle of those sticks. Now, I tried to research characteristics of vipers. Vipers are one of the classes of snakes that are really venomous. And this is what I have discovered. During winter, most of the vipers would remain very steady and stiff, that they will try to store their energy, and that they would look like stick if you are not careful enough in looking at them. So they looked like sticks, and probably Paul did not really notice that viper within the bundle of that woods because it was there staying stiff like a stick also. But when he was already placing these woods to the fire, the viper sensed that he was also in danger. Now, those people who study about snakes, many of them would say that normally snakes are not very offensive. They would be very defensive. That's a very natural thing for them. They wouldn't harm, they would just try to avoid. But whenever they sense danger and they will be cornered already, that's the time that they become aggressive and they will make an offense and bite a person. So this time, the viper sensed heat. And probably the snake thought that it's really a great danger for him. That is why it became very aggressive and it bit the hand of Paul. And while the snake was hanging there on his hand, the islanders or the Maltese looked at that situation and they said something like this: "Certainly this man is a murderer." Okay, Paul picked up the woods, a bundle of woods, did not notice the viper with it. And then when he placed these woods into the fire, the viper sensed danger, and that is why it became aggressive and it bit the hand of Paul. And while the Maltese were just around there and then watching Paul, they saw the snake hanging on the hand of Paul, biting him. And while watching that, they made a comment that is very important for us to take note. They said, "Certainly, this man is a murderer." Because even if he escaped from the death that is there when they had a shipwreck, the God of justice, or justice as the name of their goddess, did not allow him to escape without being punished or without the chance of paying for the things that he has done in the past. Now, this is a reality that many of us should realize. Realities that happen around us every day. Whenever individuals would look around us or look at our condition, they always have their own interpretation of what is happening in our lives. Have you not experienced this? That something happens to you and the people surrounding you would have their own interpretation about the things happening to your life. When someone fails in the exam, immediately they would say, "That guy did not make it because he's lazy." Just an interpretation from the people around. And not only that, while they were watching Paul, they said, "This guy surely must be a murderer." And I want us to take note of this person, this goddess that they mentioned. If you look at how Luke wrote it down, the word justice is just written in a very formal noun, justice, or it's just like that with a small beginning letter. But commentators like Colin Berger and Kenneth Barker, and even I read the comment of, Craig Keener about the book of Acts in this verse, he also says that many of the Maltese that time, if not all of them, had a perception that there is a goddess whose name justice. So this time, when Luke penned it down here, he said, the Maltese made a comment looking at Paul, "This guy must be a murderer," because even if he escaped death there at the shipwreck, the goddess justice did not allow him to run away without being punished, without paying the price of what he did in the past. So there is a goddess perceived by the Maltese, and this goddess is called justice. And this goddess is there running after Paul because they perceive him as somebody who is a murderer. He committed a mistake, he has to pay for it. That was in their mind. And you know what happened next? Not only that these Maltese had their own interpretation of what was happening in the life of Paul, but as they watched Paul, they had their own expectations of what will happen to him. The Bible would tell us that as they were watching him, they were waiting for him to have a swollen hand, And even they were waiting for him to fall down dead. Those were their expectations. Not only that they have their own interpretation of what is happening in a person's life, but they also have their own expectations in a person's life. And that happened to Paul. And so they waited and waited and waited. Maybe after a couple of minutes, nothing happened to Paul. After 10 minutes, nothing happened to him. Nothing unusual happened to him. And they were waiting and waiting until long enough for them to make a decision. The Bible tells us that while waiting, when it was long enough for them to make a decision, they were really wondering why isn't there anything that is so unusual that happened to Paul when in fact we saw the viper hanging on his hand, biting him. The venom must have entered his skin. It must have entered even his veins this time. But why are there not things that are unusual taking place? They were amazed. And they made a conclusion. People around us would not only interpret the things happening into our lives, would not only give their expectations about the things happening to us, they would also make their own conclusions about the things happening into our lives. And that happened to Paul. And so when they saw nothing unusual that happened to Paul, they said, this guy must not be an ordinary man. He is a god. A very faulty conclusion that they have made. And what was in their mind why they said that? I am trying to trace something so important in the text. And this is what I realized. In the island of Malta, the people there believe in a goddess called Justice. Justice is very powerful. That this goddess can command even animals such as vipers to bite a person who is guilty. Okay? That was in the mind of the Maltese. The goddess Justice is so powerful that she can command a viper to bite Paul. But the viper bit Paul on his hand, but nothing happened to Paul. So out of that line of thought, they could have imagined that this guy is not just ordinary person, but he is a god. And added to that probably is not that he is not only a god, but a God who is more powerful than the goddess called Justice. Are you seeing the line of thought here? When I was living in a rural area, yung tinatawag nila na mambabarang, meron yan sa lugar namin. At ito yung mga natutunan ko out of listening to my friends. If someone, isang mambabarang, will inflict something to you, you have to go to someone who is more powerful than that person. So mangita po kag mambabarang, nga mas gamhanan anang nang barang nimo. Those were the stories that I heard when I was still a very small guy. And I think that's the kind of scenario here, because this goddess, whose name is Justice, is powerful enough to command a viper to bite Paul, but now this viper bit Paul and it did not do any harm to him. Thus, the conclusion came that Paul is not only a man, but he is a god. Not only a god, but a god who's more powerful than the goddess Justice. But the story does not end there. It continued in verse 7. Look at verse 7. Now in the neighborhood of that place were lands belonging to the leading man of the island named Publius. So here comes another character displayed or introduced in the story. His name is Publius. And he had a very important role in the story because he's the leader of the island. And if you are the leader of the island, what happens to you will be known in the entire island. And this time, they welcomed Paul into their house, along with the other prisoners and the guards that were watching over them. And Paul was there, and of course, the writer Luke was also there. That is why when you look at how he wrote the narrative, there were pronouns that were written in first person, us, like we were there. We were there, we witnessed, the people told us. So he used those personal pronouns because the writer was with Paul. He saw it with his eyes. And that time, Publius, the leader of the island, welcomed them into his house for 3 days. While they were there, something happened to the father of Publius. He was experiencing sickness, having a recurrent fever, and dysentery. Now, dysentery, as I have researched, I found out that this was a common problem among the Maltese in those days. And most likely, they got that problem out of the milk that they drink from the goat. So siguro, hindi maganda yung pagkakip ng milk o kaya panis na yung iba, iniinom pa rin nila. So kaya meron silang dysentery. And most likely, that kind of condition was the one causing the fever in this father of Publius. So while they were there, Paul noticed that the father was just in the room, and he went to the room, prayed to God, laid his hand on this father of Publius, and this man experienced healing. Now, what's the significance of that with the story that I was telling earlier, talking about the earlier verses that we have discussed here? About this goddess called Justice, that it commanded, this goddess Justice commanded the viper to bite Paul, and Paul was bitten by a venomous viper snake, and yet nothing happened to him. What is the relation of that to this scenario wherein Paul went inside the room and then prayed for the father Publius, and healing happened to this person's life? And I think this is very significant because, look at this. There was a goddess who's powerful that can command a viper to bite Paul. The viper bit Paul, but it did not harm him. Then Paul must be a god, or if not only a god, a more powerful god than the goddess Justice. Okay? Following me? Now, this guy, who is perceived to be a god and more powerful than the goddess Justice, went inside the room, and what did he do? He prayed. Now listen, if you are a god, you won't pray. And that would give us the idea that looking at this scenario in the eyes of the Maltese, this story spread all over the island, and they were telling each other, hey, that guy who is more powerful than the goddess Justice, he just went inside the room of Publius' father. And what did he do? He prayed. There must be someone more powerful than him. And through that scenario, when they found out that this father of Publius experienced healing, the rest of them who were experiencing sickness, fever, dysentery within the island brought their patients to Paul, and he prayed for them, and healing was experienced by every one of them in that island. And what does the narrative tells us here is that, yes, this goddess is perceived to be powerful, but it sent a viper to bite Paul, but it did not cause any harm to him. But this guy who is perceived to be a god, who is perceived to be more powerful than this goddess, is praying to someone who's more powerful than him. And that is the God of the Apostle Paul. But one thing I would point as a great contrast between the goddess Justice and the God of Paul is this. The goddess called Justice ran after Paul based on the perception of the Maltese. She ran after Paul so that she could make him pay the price of his mistakes in the past, according to their perception. Because they perceive him to be a murderer, and the goddess Justice sent the viper so that he can pay the price, so that he could get the consequence. So this goddess called Justice ran after Paul so that he can pay the price. But the God of Paul was there in the midst of the sick people. And what did he do? He prayed for them, and healing happened. In the minds of the Maltese, the viper bit the hands of Paul as a punishment to his mistake. Could it not be that their sicknesses also were perceived as punishment for their mistakes? Scholars today would say that they experience sicknesses, fever, and dysentery because of sanitary issues. But that science was not that known back then. People had a very pre-modern worldview that when a person is sick, it is because he committed a mistake. And that is why when the Maltese were there, they perceived Paul's experience being bitten by the viper as a consequence to his mistake in the past. They could have thought also that their sicknesses, the sickness and the fever and the dysentery experienced by the father of Publius, is a product, a consequence of his mistakes in the past. So in their own perception, the goddess Justice ran after Paul so that he can pay the price. And in their perception, these sicknesses that we are experiencing right now are all ways of this goddess to run after us so that we can pay the price. Are you seeing the point here? And the contrast is this. If goddess Justice ran after Paul so that he can pay the price, when Paul laid his hand on the sick individuals and they got the healing coming from God, Paul was telling them and introducing to them a new concept, a new God, that is known only to Paul, that time that was unknown to them. And this God ran after sinners like you and me, not for us to pay the price. He's running after us because He already paid the price. He's running after us because He wants us to experience His grace and mercy. The difference between the goddess Justice and the God of Paul. The goddess Justice would run after a person to make the person pay the price. But the God of Paul would run after another person, or a person, not for him to pay the price, to let that person pay the price, but he runs after people like you and me because he already paid the price. And he wants to bestow His grace and mercy to you and to me. A different God introduced by Paul in the island, and they all experience God's mercy and grace. Napoleon was once confronted by a lady, a mother. She came to Napoleon and said, "Sir, my lord, please help me in relation to the case of my son." But Napoleon looked at her and said, "Your son murdered 2 people. He deserves justice. Justice has to be served." And then the woman told him, "Yes, my lord, I know that my son is guilty. But I am not seeking for justice. I am asking for mercy." And Napoleon looked at the lady and said, "Your son does not deserve any mercy." And the lady responded to him, "Yes, my lord, I acknowledge that. He does not deserve mercy. Because if he deserves mercy, it's not mercy at all. I come to you and appeal to you to be merciful to him." And Napoleon said, "If that's the case, I'll give mercy to him, set him free." We need mercy. We need grace. We don't deserve it. God gives it to us. And when He gives us mercy and grace, it is amazing because it comes every day in our lives. And it does not come to an end. There was a very rich man. He said to his friend, "Here is a huge amount of money. But this money is not for you. I just would like you to be a channel to give this money to that poor pastor in your village." And so this guy counted the money. It was really much. He said, "How could I send this to this man?" And he thought of, okay, hindi ko siya ipapadala ng buo. Dadahan-dahanin ko siya para hindi magkaroon ng problema. So on the first month, he decided to send 50,000 to this person, to the pastor. And then he sent 50,000 with a note. There is more to come. Ayaw mo ba nun pag makatanggap ka ng 50,000? Tapos may notice pa doon na there is more to come. Di ba ka ma-excited, ana? And so the pastor received the 50,000 with a note, there is more to come. On the following month, another 50,000 came to that pastor with another note having the same message, there is more to come. Lami ang paminaw ni pastor. On the following month, another 50,000. With a note, there is more to come. And the pastor started waiting and waiting and waiting. And it came 1 month after the other until the whole amount was already given. And I think this is actually a picture of God's grace for you and me. God gives us grace when He died on the cross, but there is more to come. He gives us grace and mercy when you accepted Him as your Lord and Savior, but there is more to come. He embraces us every day in our day-to-day living and experiences, but there is more to come. He gives love even to those persons that are unlovable, and yet there is still more to come. He forgives us every day, even if we have committed mistakes, and there is more to come. More to come, more to come. We experience God's mercy and grace every day. Tomorrow we will experience the same. In the coming week we will experience the same. In the coming years we will experience the same, with a note, there is more to come. Because as far as God's mercy and grace, it is like an ocean. It will never run dry. With that in our hearts and mind, let us all thank God and continue to honor Him for that mercy and grace that He bestows for you and for me. God bless us all, and good evening.